Let's now get to the news in detail. Let's begin with Iran, which says U.S. sanctions on that country's supreme leader have permanently closed the path to diplomacy with Washington. The sanctions restrict Khamenei's access to financial resources and target his aides. Foreign Ministry spokesman Abbas Mousavi says U.S. President Donald Trump's desperate administration is out to destroy world peace. He added the White House is violating established international mechanisms and due process. Iran's Foreign Minister Javad Zarif has distanced Trump from the Pentagon, saying both have different agendas. He says Trump doesn't want a war, but his B team is not concerned with U.S. interests because they despise diplomacy. The United States has imposed new sanctions on Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, Foreign Minister Javad Zarif, and other top officials. Trump says the U.S. does not seek conflict with Iran, but that sanctions will continue for years.
So America is a peace-loving nation. We do not seek conflict with Iran or any other country. I look forward to the day when sanctions can be finally lifted and Iran can become a peaceful, prosperous, and productive nation. That can go very quickly. It can be tomorrow. It can also be in years from now.
Let's move on to Russia now, where the Kremlin has said Russia and its partners will take steps to counter the new U.S. sanctions imposed on Iran. In an interview, Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Ryabkov said the new U.S. sanctions on Tehran are illegal. He said the imposition of more U.S. sanctions would aggravate tensions and that Washington should instead seek dialogue with Tehran. Russia also says it will continue with its oil for goods deal with Iran regardless of U.S. sanctions. Ryabkov criticized U.S. plans to deploy missile systems in Eastern Europe and its withdrawal from the INF Treaty. He warned the move could lead to a situation like the Cuban Missile Crisis. Well, the United States is also saying it's building a coalition with allies to protect shipping lanes in the Gulf region. U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo says freedom of navigation in the Strait of Hormuz is vital. The UK says it will support Washington if it takes military action against Iran. Foreign Secretary Jeremy Hunt says Britain will weigh any military intervention on a case-by-case basis. The U.S., UK, Saudi Arabia, and UAE have called on Iran to halt any further actions that threaten regional stability. A joint statement says tensions should be resolved through diplomacy. Earlier, the United States says that all countries, including China and Japan, should protect their own oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. President Donald Trump said the U.S. is the largest energy producer in the world and does not need a presence in the shipping route. Viewers will be back after a break with more news. Stay tuned. Welcome back, viewers. Now, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is visiting India to pursue closer trade and defense ties. His visit comes amid frictions over trade and differences over punitive U.S. tariffs against its trading partners. To discuss that all a bit further, we're joined now by Neha Punya, our correspondent, who is joining us now from New Delhi. Neha, Pompeo's visit comes amid tensions with India over trade. That, of course, a vital issue for the country. Do you expect the Modi administration, which has just been recently re-elected, to be in a mood for a compromise, or will it be taking quite a tough stance, do you think?
The trade tensions with the United States have actually preceded Prime Minister Modi's massive victory last month. That's when you first had the US administration speak of wanting to revoke that specialized tariff regime called the Generalized System of Preferences, or GSP, which allowed about 2,000 Indian products to land in the United States duty-free. Now, the Indian government's appeal to the Trump administration had been for the elections that hold this off till after the elections are over, and that's essentially what we saw in the first week of June. That GSP regime was revoked for India as well as a few other countries. So this is the lowest, if you ask experts, that Indo-US ties have been in the recent years. In retaliation to the revocation of the GSP, you had India levy retaliatory tariffs on 28 American products. We've seen Mr. Trump repeatedly target Prime Minister Modi personally over India's high tariff regime. He's unhappy, he claims, with the limited market access that American companies have to the Indian market, a market that's home to 1.3 billion people. He's also upset with the unfavorable trade balance that India has with America, about $21 million. Not too much when you compare it to the trade imbalance that China has with the US. Experts in India say that the Indian administration and its trade issues aren't really that high on the US's agenda, but they're also understanding of the fact that Mr. Trump is currently focused entirely on his re-election campaign, which means that there might not be any give from the American side. And US experts here in India will also tell you that India has agreed to many of America's demands in the recent years, be it stopping buying oil from Iran, limiting its interaction with the Russian regime, as well as allying with the United States on the issue of China and the Indo-Pacific. So their sense is that this is perhaps time for India to draw a line in the sand, to say that this is as much as we can compromise. So the sense is, yes, there will be talks. This issue will definitely be brought up, but there might not be a resolution as far as this visit is concerned.
And then, Neha, obviously another big issue is defense ties, aren't there? Because those have grown recently between the US and India, but then India's recent order for the Russian S-400 air defense system seems to be a sticking point between the two nations. How will that affect talks on US warplanes, for example, and other weapons being built in India?
You're absolutely right. That's in fact number 2 on the agenda as far as the American side is concerned. We've heard in the past the Trump regime repeatedly remind India that any kind of business with Russia after the election meddling row would essentially invoke sanctions against New Delhi. Now, so far India has not cancelled that deal for the S-400 missile system. It was signed last year when President Putin was here in New Delhi, and since then India has refused to cancel that particular agreement. But at the same time, it's also hoping to remind the United States that its defense partnership with Washington is quite robust. In the last decade, the defense partnership between India and US has been about $15 billion. I'm also being told by sources that on this particular visit, there's also going to be discussion of another massive defense deal between the two sides, amounting to about $3 billion. So India's understanding has been that we have our own sensibilities, we have our own reasons to engage with countries like Russia and Iran. We have historic ties with both of these nations, and it's not possible for us to toe America's line when it comes to every particular issue. But at the same time, India has also expanded its defense engagement with the United States. Now, we're being made to understand that the concern in Washington, D.C. is when it comes to sharing of technical information pertaining to the manufacturing of these defense equipment. Prime Minister Modi is keen to push the manufacture of US technology-based defense equipment here in India locally, and the reassurance that the Trump regime is looking for from India is that there's going to be no sharing of this secret information with any other country, and that's the kind of assurance that we're being told India will provide Mike Pompeo. Is it going to be enough to allay America's concerns? We don't know yet as far as that is concerned, but also to remind you that this is just a precursor to the final engagement that will happen between both sides. Mr. Modi is going to be in Osaka later this week, where he'll engage with Donald Trump directly. The first meeting between the two leaders since 2017, so a lot is riding on that meeting as well.
And then Neha, finally, I'm going to go back to your mention of China earlier. India has toned down criticism of China, in fact, since the Wuhan summit last year. Will India seek to maintain its détente with China, or can Pompeo persuade Modi to back his tough line?
The rising protectionist stand that the American regime has taken has led to a very peculiar development here in the Indo-Pacific. You've actually got India and China holding a lot of meetings, a lot of engagements, specifically discussing trade. So India and China are very keen to develop this robust relationship, but as India has often said, its concerns as far as China's heft in the region, its activities in the Indian Ocean remain. So India is likely to maintain that line of balance, that while it will continue trading with China, its concerns about a rule-based order in this region remain, which is where it will see eye to eye on America's stance. But like I said, trade here is the real sticking point. With America targeting India as well, even though its trade deficit with Washington DC is not that high when you compare it to Beijing, India and China have found common ground to cooperate more than they already have been in the recent past. Plus, you've also got that summit that's going to take place later this year here in India, where Prime Minister Modi will be hosting President Xi. So India is quite clear as far as its diplomatic outreach is concerned. It's going to continue engaging with China because that's important from an Indian perspective when it comes to trade, but it's also equally keen on allying with the United States when it comes to maintaining some sort of rules-based order in the Indo-Pacific region.
Very well, Neha, we'll leave there at that, but of course we appreciate your reporting for us. As Neha Pyonya speaking to us from New Delhi. Kuwait's parliament, meanwhile, has called on the government to boycott the US-led Bahrain conference that will discuss Washington's peace plan for Palestine.
Bahrain will host the so-called Peace to Prosperity workshop to discuss President Donald Trump's deal of the century. The US has proposed a $50 billion investment fund for Palestinians and neighboring Arab states. Kuwaiti parliamentarians say the government should boycott the so-called peace conference.
We, the undersigned, call the government to declare an important stand by boycotting the activities of this meeting and renouncing all its decisions that aim to participate in the loss of the historical Arab and Islamic rights in occupied Palestine.
In Morocco, thousands have demonstrated against the conference. The protesters have called the meeting a Congress of Shame.
Everyone here agrees that the Palestinian issue is a national issue and that the Manama Conference is treason. The states, individuals, governments and institutions that have chosen to participate have chosen to belong to the traitors' camp.
Saudi Arabia and the UAE are taking part in the meeting, but it's not clear if other US allies will attend. Egypt says it will attend the Bahrain conference to evaluate US advisor Jared Kushner's plan for Palestine.
Onto the UK now, where Conservative leadership hopeful, I should say, Boris Johnson has said Britain has doubled down on his promise to deliver Brexit in October, even without a deal. Johnson stressed the necessity of keeping a no-deal option on the table so Britain can get the result it wants. The former Foreign Secretary has raised doubts over the payment of the previously agreed-upon £39 billion divorce deal with the EU. The frontrunner in the race to 10 Downing Street claims he can persuade Brussels to resolve the Irish border issue. Johnson has admitted a hard Irish border and crippling trade tariffs will not be avoided without the EU's help.
To understand how serious we are is finally, I'm afraid, to abandon the defeatism and negativity that has enfolded us in a great cloud for so long, and to prepare confidently and seriously for a WTO or no deal outcome.
Member states of the Council of Europe have agreed Russia can now send a delegation to its parliament. Despite strong opposition from Ukraine, 118 parliamentarians from member states ruled in Moscow's favor. 62 members of the Strasbourg-based body's Parliamentary Assembly voted against the move. This paves the way for Moscow's participation in the body's election of a new Secretary General on Wednesday. Moscow's representatives were stripped of their voting rights when Russia annexed Crimea in 2014. The Kremlin responded then by boycotting the assembly and refusing to pay its $37 million budget contribution. Elsewhere, dozens of students have been protesting in the Sudanese capital Khartoum near military headquarters. Sudanese security forces used violence to break up the students' demonstration against ruling generals. The intensity and frequency of these protests have dwindled since the military killed over 100 protesters on June 3rd. The African Union and Ethiopia have since stepped up diplomatic efforts to resolve the crisis in Sudan. In related news, the UN Human Rights Chief Michelle Bachelet has called on Sudan to end its repression against protesters. She says the Sudanese authorities need to grant human rights monitors access to the country. Bachelet says 100 protesters were killed and many more were injured in a crackdown on a peaceful sit-in on June 3rd. She says authorities must also end the country's internet blackout. Forces of the UN-backed Libyan government and Khalifa Haftar's army have exchanged their dead via Misrata's Red Crescent Society. The Libyan army says it retrieved 3 bodies from Khalifa Haftar's militia killed in recent clashes south of Tripoli. Battles are intensifying in the country as both sides continue their fight on the outskirts of the capital. The WHO says 635 people have been killed in Libya since Khalifa Haftar launched his offensive on Tripoli in April. The UN says that more than 94,000 people have fled their homes since the fighting broke out. On to Iraq now, where 14 ISIS militants have been killed in a counter-terrorism operation by government forces in the northern province of Kirkuk. Military officials say the operation was conducted in coordination with the U.S.-led coalition. The forces targeted ISIS remnants south of the provincial capital, Kirkuk. Iraqi security forces declared the defeat of ISIS militants across the country in late 2017. However, guerrilla attacks against security forces and civilians have recently picked up. On to Germany, where a pilot has died after 2 German fighter planes collided head-on in the country's Mecklenburg state. The pilot of the other Eurofighter Typhoon jet was able to eject safely and survived. The accident left debris spread across 2 different crash sites, with police warning locals not to approach. The pilots were part of a trio formation of Eurofighters flying on a mission near the city of Rostock. The warplanes were part of the Tactical Air Force Wing 73, specializing in general air defense. They were the first 2 Eurofighters Germany has lost since it began flying them in 2004. Defense Minister Ursula von der Leyen has called for a watertight investigation into that accident. Elsewhere, Mexico is planning to identify thousands of human remains from morgues and mass graves. More than a decade of gang-fueled violence has stirred anger among bereaved families. Mexico will allocate $21 million to forensic labs to be established across the country. President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has said he will end lawlessness and bring justice to the families. But 2019 is on track to become the country's most violent year on record. Mexican prosecutors say 855 clandestine graves were discovered between January 2007 and September 2016. Well, there's a new acting defense chief in the Pentagon. His predecessor, Patrick Shanahan, resigned last week following a domestic violence scandal. Mark T. Esper is an Army Secretary, and former Raytheon executive. He was nominated by U.S. President Donald Trump after Patrick M. Shanahan's sudden resignation. Shanahan withdrew from his office at a time of rising tensions with Iran. Trump predicted that Esper would do very well as defense chief. Sweden and the United States have advanced to the quarterfinals of the Women's World Cup. The Swedes beat Canada by 1-0, while the U.S. knocked out Spain by 2-1. After a goalless first half in Paris, Sweden's Stina Blackstenius scored the only goal in the 55th minute. Canada had a chance to equalize from a penalty, but it was saved by Sweden's goalkeeper Hedvig Lindahl. Canada kept overall possession, but Sweden's defense dominated the game. Sweden will next meet Germany on Saturday. Defending champions, the United States secured a 2-1 victory over Spain thanks to Megan Rapinoe's 2 penalties. Both sides scored a goal each in the game's opening 10 minutes. It was Rapinoe's second penalty that put the U.S. back in the lead. The United States now play the hosts France in a quarterfinal match on Friday. Time now to find out what the weather is like around the world. And you're all caught up. Thanks very much for watching this bulletin here at Indus News.